The emergency klaxons aboard Galactic Station Prime had been wailing for exactly 18 minutes and 32 seconds. Not that anyone was counting, except for the station's perpetually anxious AI, which had developed something resembling an anxiety disorder after centuries of dealing with galactic politics. The sound echoed through corridors lined with representatives from 12 different species, all of whom were currently doing their best impression of headless poultry. Well, headless poultry that happened to possess advanced weaponry and inflated egos the size of small moons. Ambassador Kilmora of the Aqualian Collective adjusted her ceremonial gills with the kind of theatrical flourish that suggested she'd practiced this gesture in mirrors. Her translucent blue skin shimmered under the chamber's harsh lighting, and her 4 eyes, 2 primary, 2 auxiliary for peripheral vision, because evolution had clearly been showing off when it designed the Aqualians, swept across the assembled council with what she no doubt believed was regal authority. "Esteemed colleagues," she began, her voice carrying that particular quality of pompousness that only came from generations of diplomatic inbreeding, "we face an unprecedented crisis that threatens the very fabric of our galactic order." General Axel Grimm of the Draknari Empire let out a snort that sounded like a freight train colliding with a cement mixer. His reptilian features, scarred, scaled, and perpetually scowling, twisted into what might charitably be called a grin, though it looked more like he was contemplating which council member would taste best grilled. "Crisis? You mean the humans finally did something worth noticing?" The laughter that rippled through the chamber had all the warmth of a funeral parlor's refrigeration unit. Humans, after all, were the galaxy's favorite punchline, a species so unremarkable that most civilizations had initially mistaken Earth for an uninhabited rock with unusually chatty wildlife. Councillor Lunwesa of the Menthari Confederation raised one of her 6 arms, the gesture somehow managing to convey both academic superiority and barely contained exasperation. Her crystalline features caught the light in ways that suggested intelligence, though anyone who'd sat through her 3-hour dissertations on proper filing procedures might question that assessment. "Perhaps," she said, her voice carrying the crisp precision of someone who alphabetized her sock drawer, "we should focus on the facts rather than recreational mockery." She activated the holographic display with a flourish that would have been impressive if it hadn't taken her 4 tries to hit the right button. The image that materialized above the council table was enough to make every representative in the chamber suddenly find religion, or at least remember they had somewhere else to be. 3 creatures lounged in what appeared to be a human research vessel's cargo bay. Each was roughly the size of a small shuttle, covered in midnight black fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their eyes glowed with an inner fire that suggested they found the concept of extinct enemies more of a suggestion than a rule. 6 legs each, ending in claws that could probably carve through battleship armor like butter. Faces that combined the worst features of every nightmare evolution had ever conceived. Apex predators. Juvenile ones, granted, but still. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or mass hysteria. In this case, it was leaning heavily toward the latter. "Those are—" Ambassador Kilmora's voice had climbed several octaves, making her sound like she'd been inhaling helium. Her gills fluttered in distress, a sight that would have been amusing under different circumstances. "Those are apex cubs." "No kidding," General Axel Grimm rumbled, though his usual bravado had developed a distinctly nervous edge. The scales along his neck had flattened, a sure sign that even the Draknari Empire's most decorated warrior was reconsidering his life choices. The question is, how in the nine hells did a human get three of them? The hologram shifted, revealing the human in question. A female, unremarkable by most galactic standards. 2 arms, 2 legs, single head, the usual primate configuration. She sat cross-legged on the floor of her ship, apparently reading something on a data pad, while one of the cubs used her as a backrest. The creature, which could have reduced her to component atoms with a casual swipe, instead appeared to be purring. Her name, Lunwesa announced, with the kind of dramatic pause that suggested she'd been practicing in front of a mirror, is Naya, a xenobiologist from Earth's scientific consortium. Her vessel was detected 3 cycles ago in the Nexus sector. The Nexus sector. Even saying the name was enough to make seasoned space veterans check their life insurance policies. It was a region of space that most civilizations had collectively agreed to pretend didn't exist, populated by things that made nightmares look like pleasant daydreams. A xenobiologist, Kilmora repeated, as if saying it multiple times might make it make sense. Not a warrior. Not a hunter. A scientist. Who somehow captured 3 apex cubs, Axel Grimm added, his tactical mind clearly struggling to process this information. Apex adults can take down entire battle fleets. Their cubs can tear through reinforced hull plating like tissue paper. And this tiny human just... What? Asked them politely to come aboard? The assembled council members exchanged glances that ranged from confused to terrified to existentially bewildered. Humanity had been a member of the galactic community for exactly 83 standard cycles, and in that time they'd managed to achieve a reputation for being harmlessly eccentric at best and catastrophically incompetent at worst. They'd somehow managed to accidentally declare war on the Viridian Trade Federation. It had been a translation error involving the word hello, nearly caused a diplomatic incident by trying to shake hands with a gaseous species, and once attempted to establish trade relations with what turned out to be an elaborate space fungus. And now one of them had somehow acquired 3 of the galaxy's most feared predators as what appeared to be pets. There has to be an explanation, Lunwesa insisted, though her voice carried about as much conviction as a used starship salesman. Perhaps they're drugged, or controlled by some sort of neural interface, or ... Or, interrupted a new voice, maybe we're all missing something fundamentally important about humans. The voice belonged to Councillor Hicksneth of the Bordani Republic, a species known for their philosophical outlook and their tendency to ask uncomfortable questions at inappropriate times. His fuzzy, bear-like appearance was deceptive. Behind those gentle eyes lurked a mind that had unraveled more political scandals than most governments cared to count. The humans have been part of our community for 8 decades, he continued, settling his considerable bulk into his specially reinforced chair. In that time, they've made friends with the crystalline collective, a species that communicates through harmonic resonance and had never successfully communicated with carbon-based life forms. They've managed to negotiate trade agreements with the hive minds, plural entities that most of us can't even comprehend, let alone bargain with. They've somehow convinced the nomadic fleets to settle into stable territories for the first time in millennia. Your point? Kilmora asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to hear it. My point is that maybe, just maybe, we've been underestimating them. Hicksneth's expression was the kind of carefully neutral that suggested he was enjoying this more than he was letting on. Every time we've dismissed them as harmless primitives, they've turned around and done something that defies our understanding of how the galaxy works. General Axel Grimm's laugh was about as pleasant as a landslide in a library. You're suggesting that this Naya person somehow befriended 3 apex cubs? Creatures whose species considers friendship a form of weakness, and whose idea of diplomacy involves seeing who's still standing after the shooting stops? I'm suggesting, Hicksneth replied calmly, that we might want to ask her directly before we assume anything. The hologram flickered, drawing their attention back to the human vessel. The scene had shifted. Naya was now apparently engaged in what looked suspiciously like a game of tag with all 3 cubs. The massive predators bounded around the cargo bay with surprising grace, their movements fluid despite their size. When one of them caught her, she laughed, actually laughed, and began chasing after another. The sound of human laughter, transmitted through the ship's communication array and filtered through the council chamber's speakers, had an oddly unsettling effect on the assembled representatives. It was such a normal sound, joyful, innocent even, coming from someone who was apparently playing with creatures that could reduce the entire council to their component molecules without breaking stride. "She's either the bravest being in the galaxy," Axel Grimm observed, "or the most spectacularly insane." "In my experience," Ambassador Kilmora said slowly, "those 2 qualities are often indistinguishable." Lunwesa had been unusually quiet during this exchange, her crystalline features reflecting the light in patterns that suggested deep thought. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been concern. "There's something else, something we haven't discussed." She manipulated the holographic controls, successfully this time, and the display shifted to show a star map. A particular region was highlighted in ominous red, pulsing like a cosmic heartbeat. "The Apex homeworld is here," she said, indicating a point roughly 30 parsecs from their current position. "According to our intelligence networks, they've been unusually active recently. Ships moving in patterns that suggest they're searching for something." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. "You think they're looking for the cubs?" Hicksneth said. It wasn't a question. "I think," Lunwesa replied, "that we need to decide what to do with our human xenobiologist before the Apex Confederation decides to ask us directly. And based on their usual diplomatic approach, that conversation would likely involve significantly more explosions than any of us would prefer." Ambassador Kilmora straightened her ceremonial robes, a gesture that looked more like armor checking than fashion adjustment. "Very well. Bring them here, the human and the cubs. We'll conduct a formal inquiry." "All of them?" Axel Grimm asked, his military mind clearly calculating the potential catastrophe of having 3 apex predators loose on a space station. "On the station? Where else would you suggest? Your ship?" The general's scales flattened further. "Point taken." As the council members began making arrangements for what was sure to be either the most interesting or the most terminal interrogation in galactic history, none of them noticed the small detail that would soon become monumentally important. In the holographic display, as Naya played with the cubs, one of them had rolled onto its back in what any human would immediately recognize as a gesture of complete trust. But then again, the Galactic Council had never been particularly good at noticing the important details. That was about to change. The docking bay of Galactic Station Prime had seen its share of dramatic arrivals over the centuries. Diplomatic cruisers bristling with enough firepower to level continents. Trade vessels carrying exotic cargo from the galaxy's most remote corners. Even the occasional pirate ship, usually accompanied by enough blaster fire to keep things interesting. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared the docking crew for this particular arrival. The human research vessel Wanderer's Dream was about as intimidating as a fruit basket. Small, boxy, and painted in what appeared to be cheerful pastels. It looked like something a child might design if asked to draw a spaceship. The fact that it was currently surrounded by enough military escorts to invade a small moon only made the contrast more absurd. Sensors are picking up massive energy signatures from inside the vessel, reported Lieutenant Vexmila, her voice carrying the kind of professional calm that usually preceded either promotions or posthumous medals. The young Draknari officer had been assigned to docking bay security, a position that was supposed to be boring enough to cure insomnia. Today was not turning out to be boring. Captain Zulketh, the station's security chief, adjusted his combat armor with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to expect the unexpected. His species, the Thanari, had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill everything else, which made them excellent security officers and terrible party guests. How massive are we talking? Each signature is roughly equivalent to a battleship's main reactor, Vexmila replied, her claws clicking nervously against her console. But they're organic. Of course they are, Zulketh muttered, checking his sidearm for what was probably the 20th time in the last hour. And they're all contained? That's what the escorts are reporting, sir. 3 separate containment fields, military grade, powered by... The lieutenant's words were cut off by a sound that made everyone in the docking bay suddenly develop a keen interest in their emergency evacuation procedures. It was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the station's hull itself, the kind of sound that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the primitive parts of the brain responsible for recognizing when something much larger and toothier was in the immediate vicinity. Containment fields are fluctuating, Vexmila announced, her voice climbing several octaves. Sir, the energy output from the organic signatures is increasing exponentially. Through the docking bay's reinforced transparent steel windows, they could see the human vessel's cargo bay doors opening. The military escorts had taken what was probably a sensible distance, roughly half a parsec, give or take, and were maintaining formation with the kind of precise spacing that suggested no one wanted to be the closest target. What emerged from the cargo bay was enough to make every security officer present suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. The first containment field materialized in the docking bay, with a B-21D crystalline shimmer, roughly the size and shape of a small building. Inside it, something black and massive paced with liquid grace. The second field followed, then the third, each containing a creature that evolution had clearly designed with malicious intent. Apex cubs, in person, or rather, in cubic. Sweet, merciful void, Captain Zulketh breathed, his professional composure developing some serious structural cracks. They're bigger than the intelligence report suggested. Each cub was indeed roughly shuttle-sized, but seeing them in person was like the difference between reading about hurricanes and standing in one. Their midnight black fur seemed to absorb light, creating the unsettling impression that pieces of space itself had achieved mobility and developed an attitude problem. 6 legs each, ending in claws that looked like they could open starship hulls like cans of food. Faces that combined feline grace with reptilian intelligence and just enough canine loyalty to be utterly terrifying. And their eyes. Oh, their eyes. Golden, intelligent, and currently focused on their surroundings with the kind of attention that suggested they were mentally cataloging everything they saw for future reference. The kind of reference that usually involved optimal pouncing angles and strategic dismemberment. Containment fields are holding, Vexmila reported, though her voice suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as inform her superior. Military grade, rated for Class Alpha containment, should be more than sufficient for... The nearest cub looked directly at her through the transparasteel window and tilted its head slightly to one side. The containment field simply wasn't there anymore. No explosion, no dramatic energy discharge, no sparks or smoke, or any of the special effects that usually accompanied the failure of advanced technology. The field was there one moment, gone the next, as if the cub had politely asked it to step aside. Captain, Vexmila said, her voice achieving new heights of professional understatement, we may have a situation. The second containment field flickered out of existence with the same casual ease. Then the third. 3 apex cubs stood in the docking bay, unrestrained, uncontained, and apparently unimpressed with the station's hospitality arrangements. The security team's response was textbook perfect in its execution, if not necessarily in its effectiveness. Weapons drawn, positions taken, communications opened to request backup from every available unit on the station. It was the kind of coordinated response that usually made hostile boarding parties reconsider their life choices. Unfortunately, these particular hostiles were roughly the size of combat vehicles and had been engineered by evolution to consider overwhelming firepower more of a serving suggestion than an actual threat. The cubs looked at the assembled security forces with what could charitably be described as mild interest. The largest one, distinguished by a pattern of silver markings along its flanks, yawned, revealing teeth that belonged in a museum of geological specimens rather than a living mouth. Then they did something that no one in the docking bay had expected, prepared for, or would ever adequately explain in their incident reports. They sat down, not in attack positions, not in defensive stances. They simply sat, like enormous, terrifying pets waiting for their owner to finish shopping. Captain, Vexmila said carefully, are they supposed to do that? Before Zulketh could formulate an answer that wouldn't sound completely insane, the human appeared. Naya walked down the cargo ramp of her ship with the kind of casual confidence usually reserved for people strolling through particularly pleasant gardens. She was small, even by human standards, wearing a simple jumpsuit that had clearly seen better decades. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried what appeared to be a standard scientific data pad. She looked about as threatening as a librarian having a particularly good day. The cub's reaction to her appearance was immediate and unmistakable. All 3 rose to their feet and moved toward her with synchronized grace, their massive forms converging on the tiny human figure. "Open fire!" Captain Zulketh shouted, his training finally overriding his confusion. "Protect the civilian!" The security team's weapons discharged in perfect unison, filling the docking bay with enough energy to level a city block. The beams struck the cub's center mass, producing absolutely no effect whatsoever, beyond a slight warmth that they seemed to find mildly pleasant. Naya, meanwhile, had walked directly into the middle of what should have been a massacre, and was now scratching behind the ears of the largest cub, while it made a sound suspiciously similar to purring. "Hello there, gorgeous," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent docking bay. "Did you miss me during the transfer? I know those containment fields are terribly boring." The cub responded by gently nuzzling against her shoulder, nearly knocking her over with what was clearly meant as an affectionate gesture. "Could you please stop shooting at my friends?" Naya called out to the security team, her tone polite but firm. "It's making them nervous, and nervous apex cubs tend to get protective." As if to emphasize her point, all 3 cubs turned to regard the security team with expressions that suggested they were reevaluating their earlier assessment of the situation. The golden eyes that had seemed merely intelligent before now carried a distinctly predatory gleam. Captain Zulketh, who had survived 2 decades of security work by learning to recognize when a situation had moved beyond his pay grade, gestured for his team to lower their weapons. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice carefully neutral. "Nobody moves. Nobody shoots. Nobody even thinks about reaching for backup equipment." "Thank you," Naya said, genuinely grateful. "They really are quite gentle once you get to know them. Aren't you, sweethearts?" The sweethearts in question were currently arranged around her in a protective formation that would have been impressive if deployed by a squad of elite soldiers. The fact that it was being executed by 3 juvenile representatives of the galaxy's apex predator species was either magnificent or terrifying, depending on one's perspective. The docking bay's communication system crackled to life with the voice of Ambassador Kilmora, who was presumably watching this entire scene through the security cameras and having the kind of day that usually required professional therapy afterward. "Doctor?" "Naya." The ambassador's voice carried just a hint of hysteria beneath its diplomatic veneer. "If you and your companions would be so kind as to accompany our security escort to the council chamber, we have some questions we'd very much like to ask you." Naya looked up from where she'd been examining a small scratch on one of the cub's flanks, apparently a result of the containment transfer, and smiled. It was the kind of smile that suggested she found the entire situation more amusing than alarming. "Of course," she replied cheerfully, "though I should mention that the cubs prefer to walk freely. Containment fields make them claustrophobic, and claustrophobic apex predators tend to, well, let's just say, it usually involves a lot of property damage and some very awkward insurance claims." The silence that followed this statement was the kind that usually preceded either brilliant revelations or spectacular disasters. Captain Zulketh, drawing on reserves of professional composure he hadn't known he possessed, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, standard security protocols require—" "Oh, they'll be perfectly well behaved," Naya interrupted, giving the nearest cub an affectionate pat that would have required a stepladder if the creature hadn't helpfully lowered its head. "Won't you, my darlings? We're going to meet some very important people, so I need you all on your best behavior." The cubs responded with what could only be described as enthusiastic agreement, their purring creating a harmonic resonance that made the docking bay's hull plating vibrate sympathetically. And so it was that the security escort that had been assembled to protect the station from 3 of the galaxy's most dangerous predators instead found themselves leading a procession through the corridors of Galactic Station Prime, with one small human scientist walking calmly in the center while 3 massive apex cubs padded silently alongside her like the world's most terrifying honor guard. Behind them, Captain Zulketh followed at what he hoped was a respectful distance, mentally composing the incident report that would either earn him a commendation or a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Possibly both. The corridors of the E station had never seemed quite so narrow before. The Galactic Council's main chamber had been designed to impress. Soaring ceilings that could accommodate the tallest species, holographic displays that could render entire star systems in perfect detail, and acoustics engineered to carry even the softest whisper to every corner of the room. It was a monument to diplomatic achievement and interstellar cooperation. Right now, it felt more like a tomb. Ambassador Kilmora sat rigidly in her ceremonial chair, her gills fluttering with barely contained anxiety. To her left, General Axel Grimm had abandoned all pretense of military bearing and was gripping his armrests with enough force to leave claw marks in the reinforced metal. Counselor Lunwesa had activated every recording device at her disposal, apparently having decided that if they were all about to become casualties, at least the incident would be thoroughly documented for posterity. The massive chamber doors, designed to open with majestic, intimidating slowness, had been propped wide open because nobody wanted to risk the Cubs interpreting a closed door as a challenge. "Status report," Chilmora demanded, her voice carrying just enough authority to disguise the fact that she was terrified. The security chief's voice crackled through the communication system with the kind of professional calm that usually preceded requests for hazard pay. "Subjects are approaching the chamber now, Ambassador. The human appears to be engaging in casual conversation with her escorts. And the Cubs? Still unrestrained. Still cooperative. Sir, I have to report that standard containment protocols appear to be completely ineffective against these creatures. They disabled military-grade containment fields without any apparent effort. General Axel Grimm's scales had flattened so completely against his neck that he looked like he was wearing a particularly uncomfortable turtleneck. How is that possible? Those fields are rated to contain a battleship's main cannon. Unknown, sir. The Cubs simply looked at them, and the fields deactivated. Lunwesa's crystalline features reflected the chamber's lighting in patterns that suggested rapid calculation. Apex predators are known to possess advanced electromagnetic manipulation capabilities. It's possible they can disrupt containment technology on a molecular level. Wonderful, Chilmora muttered. So we're hosting 3 creatures that can disable our most advanced technology by thinking about it, and they're being led by a human who thinks they're pets. The sound of approaching footsteps, some light and bipedal, others heavy and distinctly multipedal, echoed through the corridor outside. The Cubs' purring had started again, a sound that reverberated through the station's hull like a benevolent earthquake. "Council members," Chilmora announced, her diplomatic training finally asserting itself. "Maintain your positions. Remember that we represent the authority of the Galactic Confederation. We will conduct this inquiry with dignity, professionalism, and—" The first Cub appeared in the doorway. Every council member present suddenly discovered fascinating details about their respective species' religious practices, most of which involved fervent prayers for continued existence. The creature moved with liquid grace, its massive head swiveling to take in every detail of the chamber. Golden eyes catalogued exits, assessed threats, and calculated optimal defensive positions with the kind of tactical awareness that made seasoned military commanders look like enthusiastic amateurs. The second Cub followed, then the third, spreading out to form a perimeter around the chamber's entrance. Their positioning was precise, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Then Naya walked in. She looked around the impressive chamber with the kind of polite interest usually reserved for museum tours, taking in the architectural details and holographic displays with genuine appreciation. "Oh, this is lovely," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect space. "The design is reminiscent of the great assembly halls on Menthari Prime, isn't it? Though I think the proportions here are even more elegant." Lunwesa, despite her terror, couldn't help but look pleased at the compliment. "Thank you. The architects spent considerable time studying classical Menthari principles of—" "Dr. Naya," Ambassador Chilmora interrupted, her diplomatic smile stretched so tight it threatened to snap entirely. "Thank you for accepting our invitation to address the Council." "Oh, it wasn't really an invitation, was it?" Naya replied with cheerful honesty. "More of a politely worded arrest warrant. But I'm happy to be here nonetheless. I've been looking forward to meeting the Galactic Council for years." She gestured to the Cubs, who had settled into what could only be described as guard positions around her. "I hope you don't mind that I brought my friends along. They get anxious when we're separated for too long." General Axel Grimm stared at the creatures that could probably reduce the entire council to their component atoms, and chose his words very carefully. "Doctor, Naya, we need to understand exactly how you came to be in possession of 3 apex predators. The circumstances are unprecedented." "Possession?" Naya's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Oh, you've got that backwards, General. I'm not in possession of them. If anything, they're in possession of me." The cubs responded to this statement with what sounded suspiciously like amusement, their purring taking on a distinctly chuckling quality. "Perhaps," Kilmora suggested, her diplomatic training asserting itself despite the circumstances, "you could explain exactly how this relationship began?" Naya settled cross-legged on the floor, a casual gesture that somehow made the massive chamber feel more intimate, and the largest cub immediately moved to provide a backrest. The sight of the galaxy's most feared predator voluntarily serving as furniture was either endearing or deeply disturbing, depending on one's perspective. "It started about 8 months ago," Naya began, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to giving scientific presentations. "I was conducting a xenobiology survey in the Nexus sector, mapping previously undocumented ecosystems, cataloging species interactions, that sort of thing." "The Nexus sector," Lunwesa interrupted, her academic curiosity overriding her fear, "is classified as extremely hazardous. What authorization did you have for—" "Oh, I didn't have any authorization," Naya replied cheerfully. "The bureaucracy would have taken decades, and by then half the species I wanted to study might have gone extinct. Sometimes you just have to take initiative." The council members exchanged glances that ranged from horrified to impressed. Unauthorized exploration of the galaxy's most dangerous regions was either breathtakingly brave or spectacularly stupid, and the jury was still out on which. "Continue," Kilmora said carefully. "Well, I was conducting surveys on the 4th moon of the Kethmira system when I detected some unusual energy signatures, not technological, organic, very powerful, but distressed. So, naturally, I went to investigate." General Axel Grimm's military mind was already calculating the tactical implications. "You approached unknown organic energy signatures, alone, in hostile territory." "That's my job," Naya shrugged. "Xenobiologists don't exactly travel in convoys. Besides, the distress patterns were fascinating. I'd never seen anything quite like them, complex, layered, almost like a language." She paused to scratch behind the ears of the cub nearest to her, eliciting another round of contented purring. "When I reached the source, I found these 3 little ones in a cave system. They were starving, dehydrated, and badly injured. Their parents had been killed by hunters. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. "Hunters," Lunwesa repeated carefully. "What kind of hunters would target adult apex predators?" "The illegal kind," Naya replied, her cheerful demeanor darkening for the first time since entering the chamber. "They were using military-grade weapons, the kind that are supposed to be restricted to government forces. Energy signatures matched Confederation armaments." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. "You're suggesting," Kilmora said slowly, "that someone used Confederation weapons to hunt protected species in violation of about 16 different intergalactic treaties." "I'm not suggesting anything," Naya replied firmly. "I'm stating facts. The weapon residue was still fresh when I found the cubs. The hunters had killed their parents for their bioessence cores, Extremely valuable on the black market, I understand. General Axel Grimm's expression had shifted from terror to something approaching professional interest. You examined the crime scene? I documented everything, Naya confirmed. Weapon signatures, trajectory analysis, tissue samples from the wounds. It's all in my research files, which I'm sure you've already accessed by now. The cubs had grown restless during this part of the conversation, their earlier contentment replaced by something that looked distinctly like grief. The largest one nuzzled against Naya's shoulder, seeking comfort from the tiny human who had apparently become their surrogate parent. So you rescued them, Lunwesa said. But how did you gain their trust? Apex predators are known to be extremely aggressive toward unfamiliar species. They were babies, Naya said simply. Scared, hurt, orphaned babies. They needed food, water, medical care, and someone to tell them everything was going to be all right. Species doesn't really matter when you're dealing with basic survival needs. She gestured to a collection of scars along her arms and hands that the council members were just now noticing. It wasn't easy at first. They were traumatized, defensive, and occasionally tried to eat me. But patience and persistence work wonders, and I had plenty of both. You learned their language, Chilmora observed, having noticed the subtle vocal communications passing between Naya and the cubs. They learned mine too, Naya replied. Apex predators are incredibly intelligent, much more so than most species realize. They have complex social structures, sophisticated communication systems, and emotional depth that rivals any sentient species I've encountered. To demonstrate her point, she made a series of low, rumbling sounds that were clearly apex vocalizations. All three cubs responded immediately, their postures shifting to alert attention. I just told them that they're good cubs and that they're safe here, she translated. Though I should mention that they're getting a bit restless, this formal atmosphere makes them nervous. As if to prove her point, the cubs began shifting their positions slightly, their eyes scanning the chamber's exits and focusing on the council members with increasing intensity. Perhaps, General Axel Grimm suggested, his survival instincts finally overriding his curiosity. We should focus on the immediate situation. Dr. Naya, your research vessel was detected in Confederation space without authorization, carrying 3 creatures that are classified as potentially catastrophic threats to galactic security. Under normal circumstances, this would result in immediate detention and... He was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the chamber suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. All 3 cubs had risen to their feet and were now staring directly at the council members with expressions that suggested they'd been paying very close attention to the conversation and didn't particularly approve of the direction it was taking. Oh dear, Naya said mildly. I think you may have upset them. They get very protective when they think someone is threatening me. The purring had stopped entirely, replaced by a silence that was somehow more ominous than the most aggressive growling. Golden eyes fixed on each council member with the kind of attention usually reserved for target acquisition. Perhaps, Chilmora suggested, her diplomatic training stretched to its absolute limits. We should discuss alternative approaches to this situation. That would be wise, Naya agreed. They really are very reasonable once you get to know them. But they do have strong opinions about justice, fairness, and the protection of family. The word family seemed to resonate with the cubs, who moved closer to Naya in a gesture that was simultaneously protective and affectionate. Family, Lunwesa repeated thoughtfully. You consider them family. Of course I do, Naya replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. I raised them from cubs, fed them, cared for them, taught them, played with them. What else would you call it? What indeed, the council members thought, as they contemplated the unprecedented situation of a human xenobiologist who had somehow managed to adopt 3 of the galaxy's most feared predators and turn them into a family unit that could probably conquer entire star systems if they put their minds to it. The Cubs, meanwhile, had settled back into their protective positions around Naya, their message clear. Anyone who wanted to threaten their human would have to go through them first, and that, as every council member present was beginning to realize, would not end well for anyone involved. The standoff might have continued indefinitely. Council members frozen in terror, Cubs radiating protective menace, and Naya apparently oblivious to the fact that she was sitting at the epicenter of a potential galactic incident. If not for the emergency klaxons that suddenly began wailing throughout the station. The sound was different from the earlier alerts. This wasn't the steady pulse of a routine emergency, but the rapid, panicked shriek that meant something very large and very unfriendly had just appeared on the station's sensors. "Report!" Ambassador Kilmora barked into her communication device, grateful for any distraction from the current impossibility. "Ma'am," came the voice of the station's tactical officer, carrying the kind of professional terror that usually preceded career-ending decisions, "we have multiple contacts dropping out of hyperspace. Massive energy signatures, unknown configuration, and they're moving toward the station at high velocity." The chamber's main holographic display activated automatically, showing the tactical situation in crystal-clear detail. What it revealed was enough to make even the Cubs pause in their protective posturing. Ships, dozens of them, each easily the size of a Confederation dreadnought, but sleek and predatory in design, all flowing curves and aggressive angles. They moved through space with the same liquid grace as their smaller cousins, and their very presence seemed to make the vacuum itself uneasy. "Apex vessels," General Axel Grimm breathed, his military experience allowing him to identify the threat even as his survival instincts screamed at him to run. "It's the entire Confederation fleet." The Cubs had gone completely still, their heads raised and tilted in identical listening poses. Something was happening. Some form of communication that the Council's sensors couldn't detect, but that the young predators were receiving loud and clear. "They're not here to attack," Naya said calmly, rising to her feet and brushing dust from her jumpsuit. "They're here because I sent them a message." The silence that followed this statement was so complete that the station's atmospheric recyclers sounded like thunderstorms. "You," Kilmora said carefully, "sent a message to the Apex Confederation." "Well, of course I did," Naya replied with the tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to particularly slow students. "I found their missing Cubs. Did you think I was just going to keep them?" Lunwesa's crystalline features were reflecting light, in patterns that suggested her mind was working overtime to process this information. "Missing Cubs? You mean they've been searching?" "For 8 months, Naya confirmed. "The Cubs have been in constant communication with their family through bioharmonic resonance. Didn't you know that apex predators maintain quantum-entangled neural links with their immediate relatives? It's quite fascinating, actually. The Cubs have been homesick, but they understood that they needed time to heal before returning home." The largest Cub had moved to stand beside Naya, its massive head now level with hers. As the Council watched in fascination and horror, it began making a series of complex vocalizations, not the simple rumbles from before, but something that sounded almost like language. Actually, it was exactly like language. "He says the Ancient One approaches," Naya translated, apparently fluent in what was possibly the galaxy's most terrifying dialect. "Their grandmother. She's been very worried." The tactical display, updated as the lead apex vessel, larger than the others, and decorated with markings that seemed to shift and flow like living things, moved into docking position with the station. No requests for permission, no diplomatic protocols, just the simple assumption that they would be accommodated. "Ambassador," the tactical officer's voice crackled through the comm system. "The lead vessel is requesting immediate docking clearance for what they're calling a family reunion. Should we grant permission?" Kilmora looked around the chamber at her fellow council members, all of whom were displaying the kind of expressions usually associated with severe indigestion or existential dread. "Do we have a choice?" "Not really," the officer replied with admirable honesty. "Their weapons systems could reduce the station to component atoms in approximately 32 seconds, and they're already moving toward Docking Bay Alpha." "Grant permission," Kilmora said, making the kind of decision that would either be remembered as brilliantly diplomatic or spectacularly fatal. "And clear all non-essential personnel from the docking area." The Cubs had begun making excited vocalizations, their earlier protective stance replaced by something that could only be described as anticipation. They moved toward the chamber's exit with barely contained enthusiasm, clearly expecting to be followed. "I suppose we should go meet her," Naya said cheerfully, as if greeting the matriarch of the galaxy's apex predator species was just another item on her daily agenda. She's quite looking forward to meeting the people who've been taking care of her grandcubs. The procession through the station's corridors was surreal, even by galactic standards. 3 massive predator cubs bounded ahead like excited puppies, followed by a small human scientist who was humming what sounded like a lullaby, trailed by the most powerful political figures in the galaxy, who were all wondering if their insurance policies covered death by diplomatic incident. Docking Bay Alpha had been cleared of all personnel except for the minimum crew required to operate the docking systems, and even they were maintaining what was charitably called a safe distance. The apex vessel settled into position with the kind of precise control that suggested the pilot could probably thread a needle while performing orbital mechanics. The airlock cycled, and what emerged was the stuff of legends. The Ancient One was easily twice the size of the Cubs, her midnight fur marked with silver patterns that seemed to hold starlight. She moved with deliberate grace, each step calculated and purposeful. When her golden eyes swept the docking bay, every piece of electronic equipment in the vicinity suddenly developed minor malfunctions. The Cubs' reunion with their grandmother was immediate and enthusiastic. 3 massive forms converging on the even more massive matriarch in a display of affection that would have been heartwarming if it hadn't involved creatures that could casually dismantle space stations. Then the Ancient One turned her attention to Naya. The small human walked forward without hesitation, stopping just within reach of claws that could cut through battleship armor. She looked up at the towering predator and smiled. "Hello," she said simply. "You must be their grandmother. They've told me so much about you." The Ancient One lowered her massive head until she was at eye level with Naya. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and human regarded each other in silence. Then the Ancient One spoke. Her voice was like distant thunder, carrying harmonics that resonated through both audio spectrum and quantum frequencies. The station's translation system struggled for several seconds before producing a rendering that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. "Pack friend," the Ancient One said, the term carrying weight and meaning that transcended simple translation. "You have given us back our young. You have honored our blood with your own. You are kin bond, heart sworn, family chosen." She touched her massive nose gently to Naya's forehead. a gesture so tender it was almost impossible to reconcile with everything the galaxy knew about apex predators. The Confederation offers the human species alliance bond, the Ancient One continued, addressing the assembled council members who were trying very hard not to faint. Pack Friend speaks for humankin. Pack Friend chooses human path among star hunters. Ambassador Kilmora, drawing on reserves of diplomatic training she hadn't known she possessed, stepped forward. Your Ancient One, she began, using the formal address she hoped was appropriate. The Galactic Council is honored by your presence and your offer. We had no idea about the circumstances. Council speakers know now, the Ancient One replied, her tone carrying just enough menace to remind everyone present that tolerance was a choice, not a guarantee. Cubs tell us of weapon killers using council tools. This will be investigated. This will be answered. The implications of that statement settled over the chamber like a particularly ominous thundercloud. Naya, meanwhile, was surrounded by reunited cubs and their grandmother, all of them engaged in the kind of family conversation that transcended species barriers. She looked up at the council members with genuine warmth. I suppose I should mention, she said conversationally, that I've been offered a position as the first human ambassador to the Apex Confederation. Apparently, they're quite interested in establishing formal diplomatic relations. And so it was that the Galactic Council learned that sometimes the most powerful alliances are forged not through treaties or trade agreements, but through the simple act of one being caring for another's young. As the cubs tumbled playfully around their human pack sister and their ancient grandmother watched with obvious approval, the assembled representatives began to realize that the galaxy had just become a very different and significantly more interesting place. The paperwork alone was going to be absolutely staggering.